and I'm like a really smart person.
In tonight's episode of Trump Talk, nuking hurricanes. In Trump Talk, we examine things that Donald Trump has said that we have never heard from another president of the United States. And we bring in someone who even Trump voters will agree knows more about that subject than Donald Trump to objectively evaluate Trump Talk. Jonathan Swan of Axios is reporting that President Trump has repeatedly asked experts about using nuclear bombs to stop hurricanes. Axios reports during one hurricane briefing at the White House, Trump said, I got it. Why don't we nuke them? According to one source who was there. They start forming off the coast of Africa. As they're moving across the Atlantic, we drop a bomb inside the eye of the hurricane and it disrupts it. Why can't we do that? Joining us now with the answer is Michael Mann, a distinguished professor of atmospheric science and the director of the Earth System Science Center at Penn State University. Professor Mann, thank you very much for joining us tonight. To Donald Trump's question, why can't we do that? What is the answer?
Thanks, Lawrence. It's good to be with you. First of all, why shouldn't we do it? Well, obviously, it would do a lot of damage to ocean life. There would be residual radiation, all sorts of problems if we were to regularly drop nuclear bombs into the Atlantic Ocean. But it wouldn't work anyways, because the powerfulness of a hurricane, of a fully formed hurricane, is measured in hundreds of trillions of watts of power. That's the equivalent of a 10 megaton nuclear bomb dropped into the ocean every 20 minutes. So it wouldn't make any difference whatsoever.
And other things that could occur by dropping a bomb in the ocean, a lot of these, the prevailing winds in that area actually track toward the United States. So the radiation fallout would be in the wind system tracking toward the United States, wouldn't it?
Yeah, in fact, towards Mar-a-Lago, potentially.
Yes.
It would not be a wise decision for us to be producing that amount of radiation when the prevailing winds are indeed taking it right towards the U.S. East Coast.
And which is not to neglect the fact that to get to the United States, it would pass over inhabited islands all along the way, thereby, in effect, short-term or longer-term killing all sorts of millions of people on that route.
Yeah, it's starting to sound like a bad idea, isn't it? And I'll tell you what, if Donald Trump was serious about dealing with these intensifying hurricanes, the fact that we have seen the most intense Atlantic hurricanes on record in recent years because of the warming of the oceans associated with human-caused climate change. If he really wanted to do something about it, he would act on climate. He wouldn't try to scuttle international treaties like the Paris Treaty to do something about climate change. He wouldn't be appointing a veritable dream team of fossil fuel lobbyists and climate change deniers to run his energy and environmental programs within the White House. And so, in fact, what he is doing by not acting on climate is actually contributing to the worsening effects of these storms. Stronger storms with more flooding, more damage, more devastation.
You know, I think in your first 2 minutes of response here, you managed to give plenty of reasons not to do this. The Axios reporting is that the president has brought this up repeatedly, which means that a 2-minute explanation has not been enough for him, and that the people in your advisory position, for example, in the White House with the president in these discussions, have had to repeatedly make these points. How would you grade one of your students who you had to explain this to twice?
Well, let's just say that that student would probably be transferring elsewhere. No, it's, you know, and the president has demonstrated a complete antipathy towards science in general, and certainly to any science that conflicts with the vested interests whose bidding he is doing as president.
And what about the part that the president, we know the president would not listen to anything that you have to say here about the planet's temperature's effect on this. But even if it hadn't changed over time, could you explain to Donald Trump why the temperature temperature of the water is relevant.
Yes, warmer water means more evaporation. More evaporation provides more energy to strengthen these storms. In fact, it's a fairly simple relationship. The warmer you make those ocean surface temperatures, the more heat you're putting into the atmosphere, the more intense these storms can become. And we are seeing that intensification.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.